After nearly 2 decades of counter-terror operations the world over, the US military is now shifting its focus back toward great power competition in the Pacific. But if a real fight were to break out with China, the US would be facing a Chinese Navy that outnumbers its own by a factor of 2 to 1. And just as importantly, China has the industrial capacity to replace lost ships much faster than America could. During this modern era of counter-terror operations, China has had the opportunity to seek higher degrees of technological and tactical parity with the US, while having the benefit of not being actively engaged in expensive combat operations at the same scale. And that has allowed China's seafaring power to grow at an exponential rate in recent years, with an active fleet of more than 770 vessels sailing under the banners of the People's Liberation Army Navy, their militarized Coast Guard, and the nation's maritime militia that all take their orders directly from the Chinese military. Of course, America is working to offset this advantage, but if a fight were to break out before it can, Uncle Sam may need to get creative in order to fight and win over the vast expanses of the Pacific. And in the Venn diagram of crazy ideas versus good ideas, there is one that lies right in the middle: American pirates. So let's talk about the strategic and legal implications of the United States issuing Letters of Marque in the modern era, and why it's not as nuts as it might sound. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Sea Power. Iran has a second round of nuclear talks with US officials coming up, but first, Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, is headed to Moscow to, quote, consult with them about their path forward, demonstrating at least some degree of coordination between attacks mounted by Iran's proxy forces in the Middle East and Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine in Europe. And I've been staying on top of this story and others thanks to Ground News. Ground News is an aggregator that collects articles published by news outlets all around the world and places them all into a single easy-to-read feed that helps me not just stay on top of what's going on, but to see right through most common forms of media bias. Right here on Ground News, I can see that 32 news outlets have covered this story since it broke, including 6 left-leaning and 5 right-leaning ones. And it's still early, but at least so far, right-leaning outlets seem less inclined to tie this meeting directly to Iran's nuclear endeavors. Left-leaning outlets pretty universally cite the upcoming nuclear talks, with headlines like Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi will travel to Moscow on the eve of the second round of nuclear talks with the United States. Whereas right-leaning outlets do cite upcoming talks, but pretty universally left out the nuclear program part, with headlines like Iranian Foreign Minister heading to Russia before next US talks. And Ground News also shows you vital information about each outlet along with the headlines, like their political bias, factuality rating, corporate ownership, or government affiliations. I love the Ground News For You tab that compiles stories that are sure to interest me based on the topics I've chosen to stay on top of. Ground News is a big part of my research and my day-to-day news consumption, and it can be for you too. Just go to ground.news/sandboxx with 2 X's, or just follow the link in the description below to get 40% off the same Vantage plan that I use every day. Again, that's ground.news/sandboxx to get 40% off their Vantage plan that'll help you stay on top of things. While the American military still boasts a much more technologically advanced and capable force than China's, its massive and rapidly maturing surface fleet, bolstered by an ever-growing stockpile of long-range ballistic and hypersonic anti-ship missiles, has created a regional advantage for China in the Pacific. Even if the US Navy leveraged every vessel in its active fleet, 296 ships, American forces would still be outnumbered by Chinese ships by more than 2 to 1. Importantly, however, the US likely couldn't devote its entire fleet to any single conflict due to its global commitments to security and stability, especially regarding essential shipping lanes in places like the Red Sea. Today, the US Navy and Marine Corps are both actively seeking ways to mitigate China's numerical advantage, as well as the area denial bubble created by Chinese anti-ship weapons. Now, multiple possible solutions are already being explored, ranging from hot-loading Marine Corps F-35Bs on captured islands to the Navy's ongoing development of the MQ-25 aerial refueling drone, and now the development of an entirely new, longer-ranged stealth fighter. But despite these efforts, China's shipbuilding advantage has only grown in recent years. China's massive investment into its shipbuilding infrastructure has resulted in such a commanding lead over American shipbuilding that the China State Shipbuilding Corporation alone built more commercial ships by tonnage in 2024 than the entire US shipbuilding apparatus collectively since World War II. According to a March 2025 report published by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, this commercial shipbuilding boom is directly tied to China's rapidly expanding navy, with most of those large commercial vessels being built alongside PLAN vessels at largely military-focused shipyards. And this has allowed China to funnel the billions of dollars it earns producing commercial vessels for foreign buyers directly into its Navy ship construction. And as a result, China isn't just beating the US at fielding new ships, it is dominating the entire industry. In 2024, the US accounted for 0.1% of global shipbuilding, while China accounted for more than 53% of the entire global market. Of course, efforts are underway to offset China's shipbuilding advantage, but these changes take a great deal of time and investment to accomplish. And it's important to engage with this disadvantage from multiple angles. And if America is not able to completely course correct by the time a conflict with China did break out, there is one rather unusual and maybe even crazy sounding option that could help to offset this Chinese advantage over the Pacific: issuing letters of marque to private operations, effectively allowing non-military forces to serve as privateers for the US government. Now, I want to point out that I didn't come up with this idea, and instead, I was introduced to the concept by retired Marine Colonel Mark Cancian and Brandon Schwartz in the U.S. Naval Institute's publication called Proceedings. And although the idea seems pretty ridiculous in the 21st century, the legal framework outlined by Cancian and Schwartz is sound. And one could even argue that their assertions about the viability and strategic value of privateer fleets are sound too. Now, this might sound like American piracy, and while in action, it would look a lot like American piracy too. But Cancian and Schwartz argue that privateering is not piracy, and that there's legal precedent for the practice established in past U.S. conflicts, including the American Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. I'll quote them now. Privateering is not piracy. There are rules and commissions called Letters of Marque that governments issue to civilians, allowing them to capture or destroy enemy ships. The U.S. Constitution expressly grants the Congress power to issue them in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11. But despite their argument being technically right, it's difficult to dismiss how the piracy narrative would almost certainly affect public perceptions of the use of privateers, and potentially even the conflict at large. Privateers are not pirates in the literal sense only because a government is sanctioning their piracy. In the eyes of those who don't recognize America's authority to grant such permissions in far-flung waterways, those two terms would seem pretty interchangeable. But regardless of the vernacular you use, the United States has used this approach to great success in conflicts past. Although the last time American privateers set sail was more than 200 years ago, their approach was modern enough to set a precedent for a return to the concept. And to substantiate that claim, I'll quote Frederick C. Liner from his 2014 analysis called Yes, Privateers Mattered. The privateering business was thoroughly modern and capitalistic, with ownership consortiums to split investment costs and profits or losses. and a group contract to incentivize the crew, who were paid only if their ship made profits. A sophisticated set of laws ensured that the capture was a, quote, good prize and not fraud or robbery. After the courts determined that a merchant ship was a legitimate capture, auctioneers sold off her cargo of coffee, rum, wine, food, hardware, china, or similar consumer goods, which ultimately were bought and consumed by Americans. Now, in the War of 1812, privateering saw such public support, in large part thanks to those profits that it drove, that some took to calling the conflict the War of the People, which really goes to show how managing the narrative surrounding American privateers could make the concept more or less palatable to the American people. But most importantly, we should all set our pirate jokes aside just for a minute to address the real reason America might resort to issuing letters of marque, which would have to be a serious conflict that poses a direct threat to the American way of life, something that Americans of the modern era have never experienced before. Amid such anxiety and strife, concerns about perceptions and even the legality of privateers would quickly give way to more practical concerns about survival and quality of life. Brandon Schwartz emphasized this in a separate 2020 report for proceedings entitled U.S. Privateering is Legal, and I'll quote him now. A conflict with China would be World War III, not Gulf War III. Military and civilian leaders, as well as the public at large, should judge risks in those terms. He then went on to say that the belief that privateering is illegal under international law is really based on a common misunderstanding of the 1856 Paris Declaration, in which the document's first article banned privateering between signatory members, and notably, the U.S. is not among them. This, he argues, is further proven by the American position during the Second Hague Conference in 1907, in which American delegates said plainly that the United States has, quote, not renounced the right to resort to privateering. So in other words, America's legal justification for privateering is probably a lot more sound than it would be received by the public. But again, issuing letters of marque is not the sort of thing Uncle Sam would do if not for the pressing need. So, how would American privateers change the shape of a Pacific fight? Well, China's massive fleet of vessels in the Pacific can be broken down into 3 command groups, all of which ultimately answer to the People's Liberation Army. China's maritime militia alone accounts for approximately 300 large-hold vessels. Its militarized Coast Guard has 135 more, and the PLA Navy itself boasts an ever-growing roster, expected to reach 450 surface vessels by the end of this decade. In the event of a war with China, the American Navy would have more than its hands full engaging with such a massive force, even if the U.S. Navy does outweigh them by tonnage, which would limit its ability to cut China off from one of its most significant resources, overseas trade. China's reliance on shipping products to other nations has helped its economy to grow rapidly, but it also represents a strategic disadvantage. As Kansian and Schwartz point out, if America can find the means to disrupt this exchange, it would have an appreciable effect. I'll quote them now. 38% of China's gross domestic product comes from trade, against only 9% of the US GDP. Chinese social stability is built on a trade-off. The Chinese Communist Party has told the people they will not have democratic institutions, but they will receive economic prosperity. Now, in 2018, China's merchant fleet was already approaching 2,200 total ships, thanks to a massive external demand for inexpensive Chinese exports. And America's Navy would likely be stretched too thin to actually blockade such an expansive merchant fleet. Like with aircraft, America's preference for large and expensive ships that are capable of filling multiple roles has offered increased capability but significantly decreased numbers. At its peak during World War II, the U.S. Navy boasted more than 6,000 ships. Today, the Navy has 296 or so, far more capable vessels, but none of which can be in more than one place at a time. American Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, for instance, are too big and expensive to task with waiting out Chinese ships hiding in foreign ports, and would likely be largely assigned to missile defense operations. And this is where American privateers could offer an important service. American privateers wouldn't be tasked with engaging the Chinese Navy or even with sinking those merchant ships. Instead, they'd be tasked with capturing them, offering them a multi-million-dollar bounty on each ship and quickly compromising China's ability to sustain its export model. I'll quote Sancian and Schwartz again. Since the goal is to capture the holes in cargo, privateers do not want to sink the vessel, just convince the crew to surrender. How many merchant ships would be inclined to fight rather than surrender and spend the war in comfortable internment? Now, despite their dismissive take on how apt Chinese crews might be to fight to keep their ships, it is important to remember that these privateers would all but certainly be engaging in close-quarters fights with Chinese crews or security on these vessels. As American privateers proved more costly to the Chinese government, an increased emphasis on protecting these cargo ships would almost certainly follow. And this begs an essential question. Where do you find privateer crews who can handle this kind of fight? Well, thanks to the global war on terror, that infrastructure sorta already exists. The United States has already leveraged the premise of non-military personnel in security and defensive roles for years now. In fact, contractors in Iraq reached numbers as high as 160,000 at some points, nearly equaling the total number of U.S. military personnel in the region. And at least 20,000 of those private contractors were filling armed security roles. So while the term privateer, or even pirate, suggests an entirely unconventional approach to modern warfare, the premise sort of already exists to some extent. And while terminology might dictate our perceptions to some degree, in practice, privateering wouldn't be all that different from existing relationships the U.S. maintains with private security outfits. Many such organizations with existing infrastructure and relationships with the U.S. government would seek and win contracts or letters of marque in the early days of a Sino-American war, and then stand up their own forces far more quickly than the United States could expand its own naval force to that same volume. Rather than having to build ships and enlist new crews, which the Navy would need to do anyway, the U.S. could simply authorize existing ships with existing personnel to go on the offensive against China's commercial fleets. Of course, this does all sound crazy, and it should. But crazy would quickly become commonplace in a large-scale fight against a near-peer adversary like China. There just is no precedent for what something like a 21st century Sino-American war might look like. The massive sea battles of World War II might offer us some sense of scale, but the rapid advancement of technology since creates a hypothetical war that's just straight up incongruous with our World War II models. Large-scale warfare between technological and economic giants would play out differently than any conflict we have ever seen before. And in order to emerge from such a conflict successfully, America would have to do a lot more than just win. Once the price of victory begins to compromise America's ability to sustain its way of life thereafter, well, that victory becomes less and less pronounced. And in order to win in such a conflict, the U.S. is going to need to dig deep into its weird bag of tricks, and China's massive numbers advantage would have to be mitigated somehow. American privateers, or pirates, as the press would surely call them, might be one option to do just that. But I recognize that it's a pretty weird one. So what do you guys think? I'm eager to hear in the comments. And with that ends yet another edition of Sea Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and merch from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.